my friends, and welcome to today's show. Very excited that I finally have Stephanie Kelton joining me on the show. She's going to talk about her work, her book, The Deficit Myth, and the new documentary that features her in a central focus called Finding the Money. There's another side to the national debt. Our friend, the Sandman, Sanford Friedman, a longtime listener, subscriber, you might have met him in Vegas. He has been obsessed with this issue, as so many other people have as well, for a long time, and for good reason. I totally support it. I've just always had a hard time trying to figure out how to communicate it and make you care about it. But it's really very, very important, obviously. And Stephanie Kelton joins me today. Very excited to have her on the program. And that conversation starts at about 12 minutes into today's show. But I do want to remind you that I will not be hosting tonight's weekly hangout. Hate to miss it, but I am on a special mission and headed back home, and so will not be able to host tonight's hangout. I will be back with you next week, and I'm very much looking forward to that. Of course, as always, sorry I won't be there tonight. I will miss you. I hope you'll miss us, each other. As always, hang out on the Discord platform where any subscriber can chime in and make new friends and obviously never feel alone. I hope that you are well here at the end of the week. I also won't have a show most likely for you on Friday morning at least, so give you a heads up on that because of the very successful special mission I've been on this week. Don't ask me. I'll tell you pretty soon exactly all of the details of what's going on, and I'm very, very excited to share it all with you. But right now I want to get to what you're here for. The news, ladies and gentlemen, and then my conversation with Stephanie Kelton. So let's get after it right now. Lot to talk about on Thursday. Of course, I do want to mention these campus protests that continue. I've started to get a bit of a better understanding, and by that I meant I read like 3 or 4 articles about it this week, including a very interesting one in Vox.com called What the Backlash to Student Protests Over Gaza is Really About. But of course, protests emerge across the country, including at Yale University, NYU, New York University, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Miami University in Ohio, Temple University in Philadelphia, amongst many other campuses, of course. Big campus protest in Texas where the governor, Greg Abbott, had protesters arrested, which is never a good thing. But what's actually happening on college campuses? Vox writes, last Wednesday, students pitched more than 50 tents on the Columbia lawn in what they called a liberated zone, but the tents stayed up only about a day and a half before the president of Columbia University intervened. The current encampment violates all new policies, severely disrupts campus life, and creates a harassing and intimidating environment for many of our students, she wrote in a letter to the Columbia community on Thursday. The police arrived shortly thereafter to arrest students for trespassing and removed more than 100 protesters, tying their hands with zip ties. Some have also been suspended and removed from student housing. In the days since, pro-Palestinian student groups on other university campuses have staged similar protests in solidarity with their counterparts at Columbia. Students have also erected encampments at Yale, University of Michigan, NYU, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and California State Polytechnic University in Humboldt, California. A total of 47 students were arrested at Yale on Monday. More than 150 were arrested at NYU overnight Tuesday. On Monday, a group of Columbia professors staged a walkout to support the student protests, but a lot of the attention is focused less on the protesters' demands or the U.S.-Israeli relationship and the destruction of Gaza, and more on allegations that the protests are inherently anti-Semitic for criticizing Israel, or that specific anti-Semitic incidents have occurred, and the president of Columbia announced that all Columbia classes would be virtual on Monday, and now hybrid through the end of the academic year, to provide a reset on the conversation in light of students' safety concerns. A rabbi associated with Columbia University's Orthodox Union Jewish Learning Initiative on campus had urged hundreds of Orthodox students, Jewish students, to go home and urge them to stay there for their safety. Student protests on Columbia's campus have been nonviolent so far. Representatives from the New York City Police Department said during a press conference on Monday that there had been some incidents in which Israeli flags were snatched from students and unspecified hateful things said, but they said there have not been any reports of Columbia students being physically harmed or any credible threats made against individuals or groups associated with the university community ahead of the start of the Jewish holiday of Passover. However, a video surfaced over the weekend of what appeared to be masked pro-Palestinian protesters outside of Columbia's gates shouting, "The 7th of October is going to be every day for you," at Jewish students. It's not clear whether those were shouting were affiliated at all with Columbia University. On Tuesday, a student draped in an Israeli flag spoke to reporters within the fenced-in area of the encampment. Jewish students have been suspended from Columbia, and Barnard stated that they have celebrated a Passover Seder within the encampment at a press conference. There are anti-Semitic incidents in the United States which represent real danger to Jewish communities and individuals, and they have increased since Hamas attacks on October 7th, of course, Vox writes. The ADL reported that anti-Semitic incidents had increased nearly 340% since then. So not playing this down, but I do want to be clear and try to understand more about this, and I will continue to. But in many ways, the demands of the protests have been overshadowed by this controversy of what some threats that are being made, and I think a lot of that is being misrepresented. But to be clear, there is a coalition that has been created, and they have demanded the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which has long been organized and started by Palestinian civil groups back in 2005. And in addition to divestment from companies from Israeli apartheid, one organization has a list of 5 other demands, including an immediate ceasefire from government officials, including President Joe Biden, and an ended dual degree program that Columbia has with Tel Aviv University. So it's not so simple. It's more complicated. There's a lot of bad reporting on this, and I think we should continue to have a thoughtful and nuanced conversation about all of it. And that is what I am planning to do here on the show. So I do want to give you a heads up that I've been trying to do more of my homework, and I will be talking more about it next week with experts. But now on to other news from yesterday, and there is a lot of it. President Joe Biden yesterday signed into law the $95 billion package to provide critical aid to Ukraine and also enact a provision that could lead to a nationwide ban on TikTok. The Supreme Court heard a very important new abortion case that we previewed yesterday's show with Eric Siegel, and on Wednesday appeared divided as it grappled with whether provisions of Idaho's near-total abortion ban unlawfully conflicts with a federal law aimed at ensuring certain standards for emergency medical care for patients, including pregnant women. And on their third attempt in 3 weeks, Arizona State House lawmakers voted Wednesday to pass a bill that would repeal the near-total ban on abortion from 1864 that was upheld by the battleground state Supreme Court earlier this month. Huge news out of Arizona. At the UN yesterday, Russia vetoed a resolution sponsored by the United States and Japan calling on all nations to prevent dangerous nuclear arms race in outer space. The vote in the 15-member Security Council was 13 in favor, Russia opposed, and China abstained. So maybe we will have nuclear weapons in space. Sounds really exciting. A North Carolina man has been declared a fugitive after being found guilty last year of assaulting police officers during the January 6th attack on the Capitol, but he was sentenced on Tuesday to 6 years in prison, according to a spokeswoman from the Justice Department. A right-wing website called the Gateway Pundit, well known for spreading election conspiracies, will declare bankruptcy as it faces lawsuits for defamation, which I think is a really interesting and important news story. Gateway Pundit, run by Jim Hoft, is being sued for defamation by Georgia election workers and others. A day after the Federal Trade Commission announced the ban on non-compete clauses, business groups sued over the rule. The Food and Drug Administration approved an antibiotic for increasingly hard to treat urinary tract infections. Boeing lost $355 million in their first quarter this year. No surprise there because their planes seem to be broken. But Facebook, Instagram parent company Meta, Mark Zuckerberg's organization, more than doubled their profits. A bill would bar homeless voters in Georgia from receiving mail-in ballots and election information at temporary addresses. The U.S. announced new air travel rules on refunds and surprise fees, and that is really good. This is consumer protection from Democrats and the Biden administration, an important story to read into. And get ready for a trillion very noisy bugs, everybody. After spending more than a decade underground, roughly a trillion noisy red-eyed cicadas are beginning to emerge from the earth. This year, the Great Southern Brood, which comes out every 13 years, has already been spotted in Georgia. It is expected to converge in the Midwest with the Northern Illinois Brood, which emerges every 17 years. No one can explain for sure how cicadas know when to come out en masse or why they do, but when the two broods arrive in full force this spring, it will be the first time they've shown up together since Thomas Jefferson was president. How about that? And that, ladies and gentlemen, are your headlines from yesterday. I hope that you appreciate me aggregating them real quick. If you do, subscribe to the show and sign up now, patreon.com/PeteDominic. I don't have the audio for you like I normally do, audio clips, but I'll be back on top of that next week. But I do have a really great guest and conversation with Stephanie Kelton coming up right now. So a couple months ago, I went out to lunch with our friend, the Sandman, Sanford Friedman, who lives not too far from me and is always very generous and takes me out to lunch. I usually get a tuna melt and fries. And he tried feverishly, passionately to convince me to talk more about this issue of debt and deficit and to debunk so much of what people believe about it and help try to promote and discuss and debate the idea of modern monetary theory. And I said to him, listen, I hear you. I think it's super important. I just haven't found the most effective way to communicate on this issue, Sandman. But guess what? There's a new documentary that does all of the heavy lifting. It's so well produced. It's called Finding the Money, and I'll link to where you can watch it. But filmmaker Marin Poitras tackles the fascinating history of money and the linked concepts of taxation and debt by following an underdog group of economists, including our friend Stony Brook professor Stephanie Kelton. With a radical shift in thinking around a concept dubbed modern monetary theory, Professor Kelton provocatively asserts new hope for democracies around the world to tackle the biggest challenges of the 21st century. I am so excited to have Stephanie joining me here on the show for the first time in a long time. Of course, she's a professor of economics and public policy now at Stony Brook University. She's a leading expert on modern monetary theory, a former chief economist on the U.S. Senate Budget Committee. She was named by POLITICO as one of the 50 most influencing the policy debate in America. She advises policymakers and consults with investment banks and portfolio managers across the planet. She's a regular commentator on all kinds of radio and TV, and her amazing book, The Deficit Myth, became an instant New York Times bestseller. You got to get that. You got to watch Finding the Money, and you got to listen to my conversation right now with Stephanie Kelton. And just a heads up, I keep saying that modern monetary theory is monetary policy. It is not. It's fiscal policy. And so a correction, she makes that correction at the end, but I just wanted to make it right here at the beginning. This is something that Congress can enact. This is a fiscal policy, not something that the Federal Reserve does with monetary policy. And if you don't know the difference, monetary policy is a set of actions available to the Federal Reserve or any nation's central bank to achieve sustainable economic growth by adjusting the money supply, is one definition. And fiscal policy is the use of government spending and taxation to influence the economy. Got it? Okay. Then let's get to it right now with my conversation with Stephanie Kelton right now on Stand Up. There she is. Finally got her on the show, back on the show. So excited to sit down and talk with you. And you come right out of The Daily Show, and now you're slumming it with me and others. Thank you so much for joining us.
Nice to be with you.
How has everything changed for over the last decade in terms of what you've seen, what you've been able to convince people about modern monetary theory before we really get into it? You must have seen a lot of change and I would think progress even?
Definitely progress. Sometimes it feels one step forward, two steps back on occasion. But for the most part, I think, Pete, I don't know, maybe in the last 4 years or so, just the wind at your back. And sometimes it's really strong and you feel yourself just moving in great strides. And then there's a hiccup here or there and you feel some backsliding as governments, whether it's in the UK or in other parts of Europe or sometimes even here, start to think small and not big and start worrying about things like the national debt or something like that. And it feels like you're losing a little bit of ground. But I think overall the momentum has been that it is something of a paradigm shift that we've been able to lean into and I think in many ways lead.
I'm a media guy. I think a lot about media. I think a lot about communication. And I've always tried to find the smartest people I can and bring them to a regular audience of people who listen to the radio, where I started in Sirius XM and now podcasts and basically every other platform. I feel like the problem is that most of your audiences are already interested to some extent in money, finance, economics, and even monetary theory, politics, government, etc. But this issue that you talk about is so important. It underlies so much. And we really need to create a paradigm shift on how people think about debt and deficit and monetary theory. But the problem is, how do you think you can, and folks who, like yourself, communicate to the vast majority of us who aren't in your classroom or maybe watching this documentary, which I think is really interesting and everybody will like?
That's when you say communicate, that's the key for me. I started this blog called New Economic Perspectives with some of my colleagues at the University of Missouri in Kansas City, where I taught most of my career. And the goal there was to reach audiences of regular people and to try to enter this great debate that we were having as the financial crisis and the Great Recession was unfolding. And people were trying to make sense of what the hell had gone wrong. Why were people losing their jobs and their homes, and everything seemed to be unraveling, and people were trying to make sense of it. And of course, policymakers were figuring out how they were going to respond. And we wanted to be part of that conversation. And I just started to notice that blogs were really becoming an important place that people were turning for information. And so I convinced some of my colleagues to contribute, and we launched that, and that worked for us for a period of time. And I think it started to catch on because people who were writing really as journalists for mostly financial publications in the early part, they were writing for Bloomberg or Business Insider or whatever. They started paying attention to us, and that elevated. People started to then say, okay. And then the mainstream media, I started going on shows, Chris Hayes on MSNBC, and that helped reach new audiences. And then podcasts and op-eds and books, and it just grew. But I'll just say really quickly that one of the things that also happened, and I've never seen this happen for any economist or group of economists before in my life, and I don't know if it's ever happened for others, is that ordinary people joined a movement. It started to proliferate in ways where a couple of housewives started their own podcast, or somebody started cataloging the articles that we'd written or the links to the YouTube videos and putting them all in one place where people could find them. Just regular people dedicating enormous amounts of their time to trying to educate another person, so that you sometimes hear people say each one teach one. And it did become a viral teaching moment with all kinds of ordinary people just leaning into the movement. And I've never seen anything like that. And it went absolutely global. There are people in countries all over the world now who consider themselves, proponents, sometimes for better or worse, of MMT. They don't always get all of the economics, but I don't think we'd be where we are without the efforts of really thousands of other people.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like the answer is to communicate this issue. Watch me. You've been doing it. You and others obviously have been doing it in the ways that you just suggested. And you really have created like a community. I've seen this around your newsletter, and it's weird to have a community around monetary theory. And one of your biggest fans is the Sandman, as we call him, who's a longtime listener. But he's like constantly talking about it with me. And explain a little bit more why people care so much about this issue in a way that usually reserved for more intimate personal freedom issues and so on, or maybe that's how you want to frame it.
I swear it is the most incredible thing. And I meet people. We've been screening this film, and it started in Woodstock. That was the very first screening, was at the Woodstock Film Festival, and it happened there. You show the film, you do the Q&A, and then you go hang out with some of the people who've come to the show, and you just start talking to them. And I don't know how many women have come up to me, mostly it's women, and said, my husband is absolutely obsessed with MMT. He reads everything. He spends all this time trying to teach his colleagues or to spread this information, or he's enrolling in a class because he heard about this program at Torrens University where he can do online MMT. People just with stories like this wherever I go. And I just think they feel like it's a message that is so important, and it's something they can actually understand and articulate to others, and it feels empowering. It feels like, now that I understand this, I want to make sure that other people also understand this, because when politicians start talking about cutting Medicare and Social Security,
right,
or everybody's essentially worried about climate and wondering whether we're going to respond in time with the kinds of investments that we're going to need to avoid the worst of climate breakdown. And people know that the politicians always come up against this hard constraint that they believe is the money. How could you afford to do that? And once people think they have an answer to that question, they can't wait to share it with others.
Your work in your book challenges a lot of people's preconceptions about how money works and the way the federal government works. And I think people need to, read it to fully understand it. We can't cover it all in one interview. And the new film does a great job, I think, of explaining a lot of this. But I wonder if that the way people have been conditioned for so long to think about the federal government's budgeting, to think about it the same way as household budgets, that seems to be the problem. It's how people think specifically about federal government spending. Could we just do the best we can to explain why that's not how it works?
Yes. So I called the first chapter of the book, Don't Think of a Household. Right. So that's where, as soon as you do that, as soon as you liken the government's budget to your own personal finances, everything will be wrong once you do that. Like every additional thought you have will go in the wrong direction. You are exactly right. You have to fix that broken thinking so that you can then move forward. So what is it that makes the federal government different from an individual or a business or even a state or local government, right? And so in the book, I say the difference really comes down to this. The federal government is the issuer of the currency, and everybody else is a user of the currency. I can't issue the US dollar, right? And neither do private businesses. Mayors can't do it and governors can't do it. If we could, then when COVID started, people who were told you can't go to work, your business can't open, and those who lost their jobs would have just said, that's fine. I'll just create some currency. I'll pay my rent. I'll buy my groceries. No big deal. Businesses would have been like, pay my workers. I'll keep them on payroll. I don't need the government. Mayors, governors would have said, no problem. I can keep all the essential workers, city employees, and so forth. But we couldn't. They couldn't. And everybody did exactly the same thing, which was to turn to the federal government for help. Why? Because the federal government is fundamentally different. It's in a different position than all the rest of us as the issuer of the currency, which is why Congress had to be the one to step forward with legislation to provide the payroll protection program that let businesses keep workers on their payroll, that sent those stimulus checks, that provided money for state and local governments. Only the federal government could do that as the issuer of the currency. Their finances don't work like ours because they get to issue the money and the rest of us don't. It's as simple as that.
Just to be clear, that is true of any nation that federal government, national government, that prints its own currency. These rules, these theories.
Yeah, that's most countries that can issue their own currency. So that's the US, and that's China, and that's South Korea, and that's Japan, and that's the UK, and that's Canada, and that's Australia.
And so how popular then is MMT in Europe or Asia or Australia or the UK, which is also Europe?
Got pockets of popularity. Mm-hmm. It's a different thing. In a sense, I guess you could say MMT became de facto popular, if not by name. Certainly governments that had been worrying about finding the money to pay for programs and worrying about deficits or debt before COVID suddenly found religion when the pandemic started, and they all realized that they were going to have to spend a lot of money to protect lives and livelihoods. And so they exercised the power of the purse, which is what MMT reminds them that they've had all along. It's like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. When she realizes she clicks her shoes together, she says, they say you've always had the power to go back. All you had to do was use it.
It's such a great, the pandemic and the pandemic era spending proved a lot of modern monetary theory in a way. You can actually do exactly what you said, even with these huge debts.
The other thing it proved, I mean, it seems like it doesn't even need to be proved, but I guess it did demonstrate another key point that we make, which is you can't run out of money, but you can run out of things to buy. And so here's the government putting lots and lots of money into people's hands at a time when large parts of the economy were shut down, supply chains were breaking, ships were backed up at ports, we had trouble loading and unloading and getting
people
things,
surprisingly had money they didn't think they would have, and they started spending on things that they never thought they could afford. And then what you're saying is even on things that they didn't necessarily need, let's get a gazebo if there are any left available. But people really did try to spend a lot of money on things, and they couldn't always, is what you're saying too, because of supply chain issues. But
yeah, and it's the patterns of spending, right? Because initially it was the service part of the economy that mostly shut down. It was bars and restaurants and nail salons and gyms and theaters and all that kind of stuff. We couldn't spend money, coffee shops and all that.
Right.
We couldn't spend money that way. So we all tried to cram a whole bunch of money through the goods pipeline because we couldn't spend on most services. And so we're converting the spare bedroom to a home office because we're working from home and we're trying to buy tablets and things for kids who have online education. And so we're trying to buy a lot of things that have to be manufactured and shipped. And yes, that snarled supply chains, and then that led to inflationary problems. And so MMT always did from the very beginning say inflation is a thing to watch out for.
The criticism and really some people, you might call it caricature of MMT, is that the government can spend infinite money because it has access to printing that money. So therefore, it's sensible to spend infinite money, and there are no constraints on the government's purse. Some people even call MMT critics magic money tree, as seen. So we could just have anything we want because the government can print as much money as it wants. But you're not actually saying that. That's a misreading of what you're saying. You say that there are very real constraints on what the government can spend or should spend, and that excessive spending will have negative consequences. How do you take on some of those criticisms and caricatures of MMT and about how much the government can or should really spend?
It's so lazy if that's what somebody does, because you're just ignoring entirely the tagline, if you like, of MMT, which I just gave you, is you can't run out of money, but you can run out of things to buy. So, of course, there are limits, and we have centered inflation risk in this project from the very beginning, going back now almost 30 years. So it's always been about the productive capacity of the economy. The question is, you're right, or they're right, to say if Congress wants to write a bill and instead of sending people $1,400 checks, send everybody a $14,000 check, they could do it. They could literally do that. They could make it a $140,000 check if they wanted to. The problem is that if you do that, all of us are going to have this check in our hands. We're going to turn around and try to spend much of that, if not all of that, back into the economy. And the economy doesn't have the capacity to produce the goods and services to meet that demand. And you're going to get a huge inflation problem, which is what we have always said from the very beginning. So the trick is to recognize that you have the power of the purse. It's an incredible power that Congress has to be able to commit to spending money that it doesn't, quote unquote, have. It doesn't have to go to China. It doesn't have to raise taxes. It doesn't have to arrange the financing and hold on to the money before it can spend. It can commit to spending trillions of dollars in advance. And it needs to be careful about what it commits to spending, how it commits, what it wants to spend on, and how quickly it plans to push those dollars into our hands, or it's going to create problems. So my argument would be that MMT, better than I think any other economic school of thought, protects us, guards us against the risk of an inflation problem ensuing, because it says to Congress, listen, you don't even pay attention to inflation. You guys don't even think about it. I worked in the Senate as the chief economist for the Democrats for a period of time. And I was there over a year. I never heard a single staffer or a member of Congress ever talk about inflation. Here I am surrounded by people writing multi-trillion-dollar bills, budgets, and so forth, and they never talk about inflation. And this drives me crazy. So I think, anybody who says MMT is somehow ignoring inflation or promising infinite money printing with no risk is just absolutely ignoring the whole point of the framework.
It's easy to misrepresent and misunderstand a theory if you're not interested in it. It's also irresponsible if you're someone like many of the people featured in Finding the Money, which is a really comprehensive look at a wide range. I don't know how, obviously, the director is a pretty prominent journalist, right? I mean, you got access to the people that you did speak to, but even people that weren't featured in the film, like the current Fed chairman, has been critical of MMT. And I tried to find a former or current Fed chairman or Secretary of Treasury. Lawrence Summers is featured prominently, and I find him despicable, both personally and professionally. His theories, he seems to always be wrong about it, but he's very dismissive of it. And I wonder where you've gotten in convincing the most powerful, influential heads of nations' treasuries and others, if anybody has really started to see the light.
It's interesting that you mentioned Larry Summers, because I think he and Paul Krugman, probably two of the most recognizable economists in the world, right? And both of them, in slightly different ways, brought MMT to people's attention over the years. In an op-ed, I think Krugman many years ago, probably more than a decade ago, said there's this school of thought out there called modern monetary theory, which says deficits don't matter. And it's no, that's not what we say. Or Larry saying that MMT is voodoo economics because it says you can just print money and never worry about anything. When two guys with enormous megaphones go out there and introduce MMT to the world in this way, it shouldn't be surprising that someone like Jay Powell gets a question about MMT and is asked, what do you think of this new theory? And he goes, that's crazy, because it would be crazy to say these things, and we don't say them.
Exactly.
So
just please take on the actual argument. I couldn't even really find you debating people. I wonder, at the beginning of the film, you speak in one of the most confident ways I've ever seen anybody making an argument or a policy argument, where you say, the more time you give me, the more convinced you will get, basically.
Yeah, because I've been doing this for so many years, and it doesn't really matter all that much. I do this for the Rotary Club or a group of accountants or a big audience of people in finance or a teachers union or the pipe fitters union. I speak to all these groups, and it really doesn't matter which group you give me. If you give me enough time, I can bring the temperature down in the room, and I can provide people with a base level of understanding that will flip the way that they understand the limits on government spending, what the government is actually capable of, and things like the deficit, which have been used, frankly, to just terrorize people, the national debt, these ideas that somehow there's going to be a knock at the door and someone's going to be there, and it's the reverse publishers clearinghouse. Instead of handing you a giant check, they're there to collect $88,000 from you or something. Because we've been terrorized. It has been weaponized. These concepts have been weaponized. People don't understand them. They're legitimately afraid. And if you give me enough time with an audience, I can change the way that they think about some of these things.
Without getting too deep, one of the convincing arguments I heard against it was Larry Summers. And I know I don't agree with him because it's Larry Summers, but more importantly, it's a convincing argument he made. And I'm not sure if this was included in the film or if I saw it on YouTube in my prep to talk to you, but he said that MMT has been tried, and I think he referred to South American countries, and failed. That's always a convincing argument to me when you're talking about monetary policy, much less, I don't know, any environmental policy. It has been tried in this country, and it sounds good on paper, but it actually doesn't work. How do you take on the argument that he makes that it's been tried and failed?
Okay, first thing is, it is an old trick, and Larry, I think, was a very good debater in debate club and all this. So he knows the rhetorical tricks and knows how to do this stuff, and he thinks that he can bamboozle an audience or a journalist by citing some obscure historical incident from the 1970s and saying, this is what Mitterrand did in France, or this is what Perón did in Argentina, and then count on the person not knowing a whole lot of history so that they just say, oh, that's very smart. You just proved MMT wrong. What people do, and he's not the only one who does this, is just point to some basket case country like Sri Lanka or Turkey or wherever there's something gone haywire with an economy and say, look, that's MMT in practice. That's how we'll end up if we listen to Kelton and company. So I just think it's meant to try to score a point, a cheap point. It's not very sophisticated, but he knows that he can get away with it if somebody's not there to provide a check on him. So
one of the things that I think is really fascinating about MMT, about your book, about the newsletter, and I think the documentary, I defy people to watch it and come away with a political framing of it. There are mostly progressives featured as critics in it. There are obviously Republicans who are more likely to even to character these ideas. But my question to you, is it progressive? Is it conservative? Is it political? Monetary in theory in general, much less MMT, because I could see a lot of very conservative, quote, fiscally conservative Americans hearing you make the case and go, wait, that sounds like a great idea.
Yeah, my Substack newsletter is called The Lens, and we do often describe MMT as a lens. It is an economic framework. So it's a framework to help give people a better understanding. As a lens, you might think, when you don't see very well, what do? You go to your eye doc and you say, I'm having trouble, doc. I can't see from far away. And they fit you with the right lenses. And then you say, oh, great, I see clearly now. And they say goodbye. And you go out the door. They don't tell you where to drive when you get in your car, what to buy for dinner when you stop by the grocery store. They don't prescribe everything that follows. They just give you the better understanding, the better lens. And in some sense, that's what MMT is about. It is about setting out the right framework so we can have a better, more productive, more honest debate about what the spending capacities of the government are, what the relevant risks and limits are, and then we can debate things like the priorities. Now that we know we can afford both Social Security and Medicare, should we have Medicare for all? Should we increase benefits to Social Security recipients? And if so, by how much? Should we have more investment in education? Should we forgive student loan debt? Should we have tax cuts? Should we build a wall? All of these are political issues for a democracy and people in elected capacities in a democracy to grapple with. And MMT doesn't point in any one specific direction, but I think in an informed electorate, when you put everything on the table and say to people, what is it you want in terms of Congress, lawmakers, what best serves the public purpose, I think that's where you get revealed preferences, and people will tell you, I put low priority on tax cuts for the rich and high priority on healthcare and education and the like. But MMT is in a sense agnostic on the policy, but we trust in a democratically informed electorate to take the information that's being given to you and then use it to express priorities and preferences.
You mentioned tax cuts a couple of times. When it comes to tax policy and monetary theory, monetary policy featured in the film, in your book, and your work, you often hear leaders describe the government's treasury as, we can only spend the money that we take in terms of taxes. That's pretty simple to understand. Why is that wrong?
It's demonstrably wrong because we've been doing the opposite of that for almost my entire lifetime.
Right. If you have been paying attention.
The reality is just that the government almost always spends more than it collects in tax revenue, more than it takes away from us. With few exceptions in my lifetime, really 4 years during the Clinton administration, where the government did actually collect more revenue than it spent. But apart from that, it has spent more than it collects in tax revenue my entire lifetime. So we know that it can't be true that the government has to live within its financial revenue means. It does it all the time.
You mentioned in the book that people are often told about the vast amounts of money that they owe. It's like the Time magazine cover that says you owe $46,000 and this is your chunk of the national debt. Your point is that people shouldn't think of it this way. This is one of the tropes we hear all the time. So how should we respond? How should we think of what deficit is if it's not the amount that America owes, much less this silly breakdown of what each one of us owes?
Okay, we should think of the deficit as the government's financial contribution to the economy, to the rest of the economy. That's what it is. We've been taught to think of the deficit as a subtraction of something, right? It sounds like the number goes down because we hear the word deficit. We shouldn't think of it that way. We should think of it as an addition, because what it really means is that the government is adding more dollars to the economy than it is subtracting away, right, mostly through taxation. So a government deficit is, by another name, the financial surplus in the non-government part of the economy. When the government balances its budget in a given year, it means no deposit for the rest of the economy. And if it runs a surplus, it means they're actually sucking dollars out of the rest of the economy. So when you hear that the government is running $1 trillion deficit or a $1.5 trillion deficit, what it means is that the government is depositing $1 trillion or $1.5 trillion into some other part of the economy.
What about debt?
The debt, so-called, is just the historical record. It's just keeping track of all of the past years where the government made a deposit to the economy, and then you add it all up and you arrive at the sum total that the government has put in since the beginning of time. And so that number, people see 34 trillion or something like that. That's just telling you that there are $34 trillion being held by someone in the form of a government bond. We call them treasuries. Right. Somebody's holding $34 trillion and they're scattered all over there, and pension funds and insurance companies hold them. Banks hold some, regular investors, mom and pop, grandma.
Foreign countries like China. When people talk about China owns our debt, and they're going to call it the question, what do you say?
Yeah, that doesn't happen. Countries like China buy treasuries with the dollars that they end up holding, mostly because they export more stuff to us than we export to them. So China, for example, makes a lot of stuff and puts it in containers and loads it on ships and sends it to us. And in exchange, they get dollars. And those dollars will sit in a checking account unless China wants to hold those dollars in what's basically a savings account. And when they want a savings account, they buy treasuries. And they buy the treasuries because the treasuries pay some interest. Okay, I suppose we could tell China and other countries no more treasuries, and then they'd all just be stuck holding dollars in their checking account. That would be fine. But there's no inherent risk in allowing people to shift dollars from checking to savings. And then when the bond matures, we shift it back into their checking account.
All right. I know I got to let you go. I could talk to you forever, but is there anything you want to correct or anything you want to add, anything at all here at the end?
Pete, one thing I didn't say is you did say monetary policy quite a few times, and MMT is mostly about fiscal policy. And it's totally, everyone does it, because when you put the word monetary theory, like modern monetary theory, of course, everybody thinks it's monetary theory, which is why it's such a crappy branding, because it's a theory about the monetary system. But monetary policy is, of course, what the Fed does. Fiscal policy is what Congress and the president do. And mostly we're talking about taxing and spending and the budget, which is fiscal, not monetary policy.
I totally knew that, of course. Thank you for the correction. And thanks so much for joining me. Everybody's going to be so excited that you stopped by.
Great.
All right.
Thanks.
Of course.
All right. See you in 10 years.
Yeah.
All right. Bye.
Well, there you go, ladies and gentlemen. Stephanie Kelton, Modern Monetary Theory, Finding the Money is the documentary. I watched it. It's real good. I highly recommend that you do. You can find out how in the links to the show notes. Definitely let Stephanie know that you heard her here on the show. That's a big deal. She is still active on Twitter, so please, if you are, go over there and let her know that you heard her here on Stand Up. Review this show on Spotify and iTunes. And thank you very much for all of your support. If you're not already a subscriber, subscribe now, patreon.com/Pete Dominick. Sorry I'm not hosting a hangout tonight. I look forward to seeing you next week. And know that you're never alone if you're a member of the stand-up community. You can always find someone to talk to in the Discord platform. If you're not already using it, then go check it out right now. Directions in every day's email that you get as a subscriber, as well as a shot of vitamin N. Send me your vitamin N pictures, your nature shots, no man-made objects included, right now to standupwithpete@gmail.com. And you know what? Screw it. Send everything else there as well. Any questions, comments, criticisms, suggestions? I want to hear from you. Email me. I love you guys, bumblebees. Thank you very much for listening all the way to the end. You're the specialist.
off of your fence. Even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Oh, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of the stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.